With hundreds of TV cameras in the Gulf, where were the pictures of those new and powerful weapons? What was really happening away from the eye of the camera on the battlefields of Desert Storm? I was in Baghdad reporting that war. 5 years on, I've come back to try and set the record straight. It was a war where information was part of the armory. We were controlled by the military and allowed ourselves to be. An honourable few rebelled. Most of us did what we were told. In the course of this journey, we've uncovered what we should have found out then: Iraq's secret chemical war, and the coalition forces' use of napalm and shells tipped with spent uranium.
The invasion began at 2 a.m. 100,000 Iraqi troops swept across the border and made a high-speed dash towards Kuwait's capital, 80 miles to the south.
Despite the warnings, the world was shocked by the Iraqi invasion. 5 years later, Kuwait is back to normal. The oil is flowing, the palaces are rebuilt, and the roads are clogged with expensive American cars. But the people of Kuwait are determined that the invasion should not be forgotten. They have set up a lavishly equipped research centre just to document the brutality of the Iraqi occupation.
دخولها بعد التحرير مباشرة. من ذلك استخدام آلة الدريل لإرهاب وتعذيب الكويتيون، وهناك أدوات كثيرة تم العثور عليها مما يستعمل في عملية التعذيب.
One detail they will leave out of their version of history, however, is how several days after the occupation began, the Kuwaiti government employed an American public relations firm at a cost of $11 million. Propaganda supplied by public relations consultants Hill and Knowlton was swallowed whole by the US political leadership.
Young kids were passing out leaflets in opposition. They were taken, their families made to watch, and they were shot to death, 15 and 16-year-old. Older people on dialysis machines, taken off the machines and the machines shipped to Baghdad. Kids in incubators thrown out so that the machinery, the incubators themselves, could be shipped to Baghdad.
While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators, took the incubators and left the children to die on the cold floor. It was horrifying.
Nair al-Saba, the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador in Washington, was never in the incubator ward. Nurses who worked there said they had never seen her. She was coached for her testimony to the congressional hearing by Hill and Knowlton. Robert Gray was in charge.
It's always difficult, of course, in a democracy, as you know, to get public support heavily behind a commitment to go to war. And the administration had made the commitment, and it was our job to help educate the American public on the advantages to it so that the support would be there.
I think the impact was enormous. I think it was a story...
Andrew Whitley worked for the human rights organisation Middle East Watch. When he investigated the story, it just didn't hold water.
Any depravity. Most of the incubators, which had apparently been stolen, had been stored away. When we went to the maternity hospital, we saw that there was an entire wing which had been stripped and they had been put away into a storeroom.
If we've erred, obviously I will always hope I will apologize. I'd like to be man enough to apologize in all circumstances if one is due. If I were convinced one is due, then indeed I'd apologize to anybody I misled. But I would hope that they'd understand it was a very unintentional misleading, and I'd hope you'd understand that too.
I think it was a major lie. I don't believe that there was any truth, in fact, as to Iraqis having deliberately, systematically removed babies from incubators in order to steal them. And I think it made a major impact on public opinion in this country.
And that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with Hitler revisited. a totalitarianism and a brutality.
Enough US senators were persuaded by the incubator baby story to vote in favor of the use of force.
Must not stand.
Bush got his war. The demonization of the Iraqis had served its purpose.
Following the same track.
Allied forces continue the heaviest aerial bombardment of all
Baghdad's
time.
lights were still blazing when the strike planes from Desert
Up
Storm.
to 80,000 bombs and hundreds of missiles have been dropped on
The
Iraq.
cruise missiles were map-reading themselves over the gauntlet of
over
gunfire.
our hotel. However, we have not yet heard the sound of bombs landing, but there's tremendous lightning in the sky, lightning like...
Peter Arnett, America's most famous war correspondent, got on the wrong side of the military authorities very quickly. When did your good relationship with the US military begin to fray a bit around the edges?
As the bombing campaign developed, and I was revealing every day more excesses, in a sense, of bombing, that they were villages, 20, 30, 40 houses had been destroyed.
This is not a game. Those are human lives! Human lives! Enough of civilians!
Only about 6% of the bombs used in the Iraq war were guided missiles, and they were mainly in Baghdad, the most high-profile target. Elsewhere in the country, they were using these dumb bombs, and they were devastating many localities we were visiting.
The crunch came when Arnett challenged the US military's account of an attack on what he said was a baby milk factory. US intelligence claimed that it was being used for biological weapons. Arnett wouldn't play ball.
Marlon Fitzwater came out in the White House and said, you know, Peter Arnett is a dupe of Saddam Hussein. This proves it. And he said, we have evidence, we have absolute proof that this plant that he says is a baby milk factory is in fact used for and part of the weapons testing program of the Iraqis. If this was a biological testing center, they would not have let us walk all over the premises, accompany us around the premises, let us touch everything, pick up samples such as this bag. We used it for coffee. That's how confident I was. The U.S. government is perfectly capable of lying, you know, to achieve its aims in a time of national crisis, and they did. They did. It was very effective because in the years that followed the Gulf War, that was the most frequently asked question. What about the baby milk plant? And not only the question was always, you were duped, weren't you? So that was the single most effective piece of military black propaganda that I've seen in my whole career, and I've been in this business for 35 years.
This was the beach at Al-Hafji near the Kuwait border. The first victims of the disaster struggling to free themselves from its grip.
Nobody knew where the oil came from, but overnight the bird became yet another symbol of Saddam's depravity, a man who had declared war on nature itself. Iraqis who caused the oil slick, nobody was too sure. But it was a great story, too good to spoil with the truth. Bill Arkin, formerly in military intelligence, now lives in Vermont. His access to Pentagon military records gives him an exceptional insight into the Gulf War.
I think that one of the biggest cover-ups of the Gulf War is the fact that the U.S. Navy and the Allied Air Forces attacked Iraqi oil installations and oil tankers and didn't want to acknowledge that there was a tremendous amount of controversy over that very point. And so therefore they hid behind claims of Iraqi environmental terror to avoid a debate as to whether those are legitimate targets in warfare.
President Bush accused Saddam of environmental terrorism. Yet at the same time, the Americans and the Allies were doing the same thing.
I believe most of what was caused by Allied planes was accidental. And if you don't think torching 960 oil wells or whatever it is environmental terrorism, I don't know what is.
Accidental and the bombs just fell out, or what? What do you mean by accidental? Targets?
No, not oil platforms. I do not believe oil platforms were targets, no. No. Distribution centers were. But
what about vessels? What about oil carriers?
No, they were stopped. They weren't sunk. I don't remember any being sunk.
They attacked those two oil platforms at Mina al-Bakr and at Al-Kubar, and also at the same time they attacked ships that were oil-related ships. On the 18th of January, on the second day of the war, French aircraft attacked an Iraqi tanker that was moored at Mina al-Ahmadi on the Kuwaiti coast. And those were the very tankers that a few days later they stated were expelling their oil into the sea.
How much of that environmental damage, in your view, with the oil slicks, was done by the Allies?
It's very clear that the U.S., in bombing offshore oil facilities and in bombing tankers, I think 5 tankers overall were bombed in the air war, caused probably 20 or 30% of the oil that was eventually expelled. So somewhere in the area of 2 to 3 million barrels of oil was as a result of Allied action.
You don't remember a discussion about whether or not this would cause serious damage and whether or not they should go ahead with it?
We had a lot of discussions about oil, and we were very sensitive to the environmental damage, and we did our best to contain it, absolutely. But to say that because we did some damage that the Iraqis were environmentally pure is obscene.
That's not what I'm saying.
It's obscene.
So it is a cover-up. It was a cover-up.
Oh, absolutely. There's no doubt about it.
Do you think they lied about it?
Well, of course they lied about it. I mean, have you ever read in any report that the U.S. Navy or the French Air Force attacked Iraqi oil tankers and were responsible for much of the oil that flowed into the Gulf? No. Is that a cover-up? Is that a lie? Of course it is.
In Baghdad, Saddam Hussein is everywhere. People speak his name in whispers and live in absolute terror of him. When his people rose against him in desperation, they were crushed, and their leaders hanged from the roofs of their own mosques. Sanctions have pushed 4 million people in this once prosperous nation to the edge of starvation. But Saddam doesn't care. Today he's constructing a new palace in Baghdad, 2 miles from where his people queue for slops.
Five, 4, 3, 2, 1, launch.
Missile away! Out in the Gulf, a Tomahawk missile drills up into the ink-black sky. Deep down in the blue half-light of the control room, American sailors huddle over their radar screens, plotting its progress towards Iraq.
And this is my counterpart's headquarters in Baghdad.
As the war went on, the video show became more clinical, obscene and surreal.
Eye on all sides of the building as the airplane overflies the building and drops the bomb.
According to the military briefing in Saudi Arabia, you could blitz 18 million people and nobody would get hurt. Yet the demonization of Saddam Hussein was so total that his people also became demons, children of the devil, and it didn't matter what you did to them. Until 2 1,000-pound bombs slipped down the ventilation shaft of a bomb shelter in Baghdad in the early hours of a February morning. Then briefly, the reality of war was flung into our faces for the first time. American intelligence in Baghdad had sent reports that Iraqi military vehicles were parked outside this particular shelter at night. The spies didn't bother to mention that 300 women and children were inside, watching videos. Among them was the family of Tareq Mohammed. His wife and his 4 children all died that night. Collateral damage.
This is your wife,
yes? Yes, this one. This Lina. This Sadat. This Zina. It is not good picture. They're more beautiful than these.
Where were you on the night when they all died?
انتظرنا لما انطفى النار وحاولنا نعثر على الجثث ما لقيناها. كانت مخلوطة قسم باقي بس شيء قليل من أجسامهم. قسم ما هي قد محروقين.
Did you go to look for the survivors? Did you ask? When was the moment when you said, I know they are dead?
لحد الآن أنا يعني مثلا مرات بالبيت هسه من أقعد أشوفهم واقفين دي أشروا لي لا عقلي ما يتقبله. كنت متعلق أثمن شيء كانوا بالنسبة لي. أثمن شيء كانوا بالنسبة لي.
The coalition's worst nightmare was that Saddam Hussein would use his chemical and biological weapons, his notorious Al-Hussein Scud missiles. The Western military have always denied that chemical weapons were used. Their denial during the war can be understood. They didn't want to terrify the soldiers. But in our investigation, we have found dozens of soldiers who say that chemical weapons were used, something the British government continues to deny. One eyewitness is Richie Turnbull, a chemical expert with the RAF. On the 20th of January, he was stationed at one of the biggest Allied air bases at Darhan in Saudi Arabia.
I was on nights that night when all of a sudden there was a Patriot fired from near our position. And there was one almighty bang over our head as it intercepted the Scud. The warhead landed within about 400 yards of our position, and all the pre-positioned naiads started giving the alarms. So we got into full protective equipment, NBC Black, which is the highest state of alert. We then carried out further tests using what they call a CAM, which is a chemical agent monitor. It's a small handheld device, which again confirmed the presence of nerve agent. We then carried out a third test, which is called a residual vapor detector test. What it is, it's a small puffer bottle that draws air over a chemical-sensitive disc. This again came up positive, so we carried out 2 further RVDs, residual vapor detector tests, and informed the nuclear biological chemical control cell that we had an incident of nerve agent on the base. Every naiad in the area was blasting the alarm. There was 27 naiads giving the alarm off at the same time, so it wasn't one piece of equipment. And then we were told it was a false alarm due to unburnt aircraft fuel on takeoff. The next day I tried to reproduce the alarm using the aircraft fuel. Never did, but when I used a simulated test substance, it worked every time. I'm convinced we had a chemical weapon attack, and the manufacturers tell me, when I've spoken to them since, if that thing shouts, it's there.
We've interviewed a number of Gulf War veterans who believe that they were poisoned by low-level chemical weapons attacks. That view is backed up by a number of reports of chemical attacks by the Iraqis. What's your knowledge of
No,
this?
I didn't have any evidence brought to me, and I didn't hear any confirmed evidence that there were any.
You don't think it's a case
There may
of...
have been, I mean, I think at the end, afterwards, in hunting around, I was suggesting there may have been, he may have had a few. But I don't think anything very significant.
It was significant enough for Richie Turnbull. Like 4,000 other British Gulf troops, he's now sick. He has a terminal lung disease and must spend an hour every day on a ventilator. The chemical attack on Richie Turnbull was confirmed by a Czech detection team, now based near Prague. They tell how orders came from Central Command to ignore their findings, a bizarre order because the Czechs are world leaders in chemical warfare. They, unlike the British and Americans, train with live chemicals, spend years specialising in the field, and are the only units to use mobile laboratories to double-check their findings. Richie Turnbull saw the Scud land at Daran. The Czechs were based at King Khalid military city. In the team was Major Peter Zelinsky.
20. nebo možná 21. ledna, já si to přesně nepamatuju, kdy se to stalo. Jsem se nacházel v městě King Khalid military city a v tom období naše chemická hlídka, která monitorovala okolí toho města, naměřila chemické látky v tom období. A pak byl vyhlášen chemický poplach a všichni jsme si nasadili masky. V tom období prostě foukal vítr ze západu, teda z východu na západ. To znamená, že od toho přístavu od moře. Ale ty větry jsou jako výškový a přízemní. A ten přízemní vítr foukal z tyhlety části. Jako od těch přístavů, od Zahránu a od Dahránu.
For the past 5 years, UN teams have been trying to prise the truth out of the Iraqis about their chemical and biological weapons. What they have found has terrified the scientific world. Colonel Terry Taylor was the British representative on the UN investigation team.
On the chemical weapons side, the major agents they had was mustard agent, a lethal agent, but also causes extensive burns and very serious incapacitating injuries, very painful, nasty agent. And the other major agent was nerve agent. On the biological side, they had 2 lethal agents already weaponized. Anthrax is one, and botulinum toxin was the other one. And these were put in aerial bombs, 122mm rockets, and Al-Hussein missile warheads. They have admitted to that. The authority was delegated at the time of the war, and these weapons were in the hands of the commanders in the field.
One of the commanders in the field was this man, a colonel in the elite Republican Guard. He confirms that chemical weapons were being stored on the Iraqi front line.
What kind of chemical weapons were there? How were they stored?
المخازن اعتاد المدفعية الميدانية يعني اللي ترمى بقبل مدفعية هذه بخبر تحت الأرض في صناديق خاصة ومؤشرة خاصة كل 10 صناديق قنابل اعتيادية يخلون وحدة قنبلتين في صندوق كيميائي وهذه يعني مميزة عن البقية اللون والشكل يعني بيعرفها انه هذه عتاد كيميائي وهذا عتاد اعتيادي.
In the history of modern warfare, soldiers in the trenches have been betrayed many times. The Vietnam Memorial in Washington records the names of thousands of veterans who died there. What it doesn't record is the many thousands who are sick or who have died from the effects of Agent Orange, the chemical used to clear the jungle, which also poisoned American troops. The Vietnam veterans battled through presidency after presidency before they were finally told the truth. Today, history repeats itself. In the United States, 70,000 soldiers have registered sick with Gulf War syndrome. Some recall similar experiences of gas attacks during the Gulf War.
This is just strictly...
Nick Roberts wants to know what happened to his unit when an Iraqi Scud exploded near their camp in Saudi Arabia.
I haven't been able to keep up with the entire group, only a lot of the veterans in this area. I know there's 43 sick.
Out of a group of how many?
112.
They've been prodding and poking and doing this.
Roy Butler was a member of that same group.
Sticking your muscles.
He's undergoing medical tests to find out why he's sick.
Spinal tap, man, makes it back sore.
Nick and Roy's unit were based at the port of Al Jubail in Saudi Arabia.
We were waking about 3 o'clock in the morning with a loud explosion. It just shook the whole tent, and it's sort of like everybody thought the world was coming to an end, you know.
If you want to get real technical, I saw a big fireball or flash up towards the portage ball, and then the echo of the explosion. Then we went to the bunker.
And while we was outside, we felt this mist type stuff, like, you know, like a rain.
My hands and my face were stinging and burning. My lips started feeling funny, like they were numb. That's when the sirens started going off.
I had put on my mask while going to the bunker, and when I got to the bunker, I had to take it off and clear my nasal passages. It was completely blocked. I got all kinds of gooey mess out of it, and I put my mask back on. My upper and lower lips started turning numb.
And that's when we heard coming in over the radio, you know, full chemical alert, go to mop level 4. That's where you put all your chemical equipment on. And we also heard over the radio, confirmed blister agent.
We were told to keep our mouth shut about it, you know, kind of like a direct order at a formation the next day or the day after, not to talk about it anymore. That it would create so much havoc and confusion and panic amongst the men to not talk about it.
We had pretty bad attitudes. After that point, we started getting an attitude. We knew we were being lied to. We couldn't get any medical help. No one would answer any of our questions, and we were getting sick. We were getting sick within a week after the explosions. A lot of us were laying in bed with night sweats, with the flu, rashes, and it was all being put in our medical records. Those medical records do not exist any longer.
What does exist and has recently been released under the Freedom of Information Act are Central Command records of chemical detections. It took 4 years to get these logs released, yet whole sections are missing. Jim Chewett, ex-CIA, was in charge of a US Senate investigation into chemical attacks. We asked him what the logs reported on the night Roy Butler and Nick Roberts got sick.
What they told the soldiers was that it was a sonic boom. But one thing we know that refutes that is that, number one, chemicals were detected. Number two, visible explosions were seen. Number three, the soldiers got sick, nausea, vomiting, burning, stinging. Several days later, they got very ill with flu-like symptoms consistent with low-level exposures to agents or possibly even biotoxins, biochemical agents, poisons from bacteria. But we also know that the Iraqis were working on chemicals and biochemical agents, biological agents, that would maim, that things like aflatoxins, which make you sick in the short term, nausea, vomiting, but in the long term cause cancers.
I've now got lymphoma cancer. When I finally caught it, it was stage 3. And that's cancer of the immune system, lymph nodes. And I've went through 3 different treatments of chemotherapy.
And what have the doctors told you about your health?
Just deteriorating, to be honest with you.
Department of Defense has failed to tell the truth about this issue ever since the war. They failed to tell the truth during the war. They failed to tell the truth when we first asked them for the information about what the soldiers may have been exposed to and what their experiences were during the war. So if you're asking me if I believe that they've been dishonest to our veterans, very much so.
At the time, the war made great TV. It still does. It was dramatic, it was sexy. The world getting off in a really good war. American forces broke through the Iraqi front lines in February 1991 with a tactic that had never been seen before in warfare. They used specially adapted bulldozers to bury the Iraqis alive. Among the first to reach the Iraqi trenches was Joe Queen from Alabama. He got a Bronze Star.
My job was to cover in the trenches and to cave in the bunkers. right, where the Iraqis were living. So they couldn't, if they overran us again, they couldn't occupy the same positions once again.
And did the Iraqis keep firing at you?
The Iraqis, when the Bradley went through, some of them were so shell-shocked that they just came out running.
Where you're sitting up there, I mean, if there's an Iraqi down here in the trench,
you're not going to see him. You know, that's what I said. I don't know exactly who was in the trench, or just like the bunkers. You know, you're up there, it's called a half hatch, right, it's locked halfway down, and you're looking through your vision blocks because you don't want to get shot. You know what you got to do. You did it so much you can close your eyes and do it. So you're actually down inside, buttoned up just like it is right now, you know, looking through the vision blocks, moving on with the mission.
So we started plowing before we hit his minefields. We plowed through his trench line. We suppressed the trench line with a Bradley, and if he returned fire, we simply put a plow tank on each side of the trench and buried those Iraqi devils that were in the trench. And we buried about 400 Iraqis in their trenches.
شفت بعض الجنود اللي طلع من الملجأ اللي جسمه اثناء الزحف الدبابات فوقها انقسم لانه البلدوزر تصور لمن مدفع دبابه طلع فوق ان تدوس على انسان تصور شلون تصير الحاله واللي المجموعه الثانيه رفع بالشافل واندفن هو اثناء ومع التراب ومع الجنود داخل الملجأ.
Did you see any of them that were left in the trenches?
There were some Iraqis that were shot that were in the trenches as I came through, but I was so focused on just doing what I had to do and trying to keep up with the convoy, I didn't pay that much attention. I don't know what was in the bunkers when I caved them in. Once I caved them in, I covered them up, and that's how I left.
How many people died in the trenches?
هي اللي شفتهم تقريبا على تقريبا قلت لك 300 350. لأن المجموعة اللي احنا بيه تقريبا من 500 من الموقع اللي شفته قريب عليه. أنا مو ظل أنظر إنه يصير أشوف اللي قدامي اللي صار.
1,000 dead Saddam Hussein soldiers not worth one U.S. soldier's life. So what we did is we took the tanks with the plows, and we fired down the trench line, and if little white flags came out and they surrendered, they were allowed to surrender. If they returned fire, we simply buried them and moved on about our business.
When the story about the plowing of the soldiers was revealed, when rumors have circulated about the use of napalm, when people have talked about the possibility that the U.S. used fuel-air explosives, or these daisy cutter 15,000-pound bombs were dropped, or even B-52s doing carpet bombing, for some reason or another, the U.S. always denies it. You know, they always say it didn't happen. And I'm here to tell you now, it did happen. And to some degree, you have to say, well, big deal, that's what happens in war. But it is not without some degree of irony that every time one of these issues is revealed, the first reaction of the Pentagon is to say, not true, never happened. And then their second reaction is to say, oh, well, let me tell you something, you know, war is a terrible thing, and this is what happens in war. But yet they don't want people to see it.
How do you think the American people would have taken it if they thought Iraqi troops were being buried alive?
I think, look, this is war. Is being buried alive worse than being shot through the head?
I think it is, actually.
You do?
I would
well,
shot to death.
would you rather send troops armed with rifles down into those bunkers to kill the Iraqis and to be killed? If you can kill them by burying them, what difference does it make, other than a minute or two of their lives?
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ألف ذلك الكتاب لا ريب فيه هدى للمتقين الذين يؤمنون بالغيب ويقيمون الصلاة ومما رزقناهم ينفقون.
كان هناك شخص عزيز علي جدا في تلك يعني اللحظة، يعني ما استطعت أنه أسعفه لأنه كانت نسبة النابالم كثيرة عليه والقصف مستمر، يعني اللي يخرج يعني لازم أيضا يموت معه.
Almost 500 napalm bombs were dropped on the Iraqi trenches, but we never saw them land, something else the US military didn't want us to see.
يعني النابالم هو يعني يحرق، هذول اللي ماتوا بالحرق، يعني ماتوا محروقين، وليس يعني ماتوا بسبب يعني شظية أو شيء آخر، يعني احترقوا رأسا. يعني ما استطعنا أن نسعفهم، لأنه نسبة الجيلاتين أو نسبة النابالم على جسمهم كانت كثيرة، في حين أكو قسم منهم كانت يعني فقط ايديهم أو فقط ظهره أو فقط راسه، يعني قدرنا هذا نسعفه، بس الباقين ما استطعنا بسبب يعني ضخامة القصف اللي كان في وقتها. يعني كانوا ضربونا في 4 قنابل نابالم في مكان واحد، في مكان واحد 4 قنابل نابالم، يعني هذا شيء كثير، يعني لا يمكن أن يتصور الإنسان. يعني كأنما عايشين يعني جهنم في ذلك الوقت.
But do you think the American people would be shocked to know that the American army dropped napalm bombs on the Iraqis?
No, I don't think so. It's a very unpleasant weapon. Yes. But in some cases, there is no other way to get troops out of deeply entrenched bunkers. You can't get them out any other way.
حضرنا نفسنا للموت اعتيادي، يعني كنا متوقعين في أي لحظة نموت، بس يعني ما نموت يعني موت يعني اعتيادي، لا نموت لازم يعني يكون في قتال، يعني ما نموت يعني موتة سهلة.
As soon as you dehumanize someone, you can do anything you want. Humanity is thrown out the window. That's why we had to dehumanize Iraq and Saddam Hussein and everything before this war ever happened. And the press had to willingly cooperate in that dehumanization.
Ken Juraski was a war photographer for Associated Press.
Guys, you got soldiers with weapons.
He decided that this would be his last war. His pictures were censored. Nobody wanted to spoil a good war with pictures like these. You took one particular picture which certainly in Britain was published and had a big impact.
The guy trying to get out of the truck, his humanity is still intact, and a person can still feel that this was a living, breathing person that was trying to survive. And up to the very last minute, with his skin burning off his bones, life was so precious that he was still trying to save it. And I figured that when I got back to the States, I'd be seeing the photo everywhere. But the Associated Press, when it got to New York, they pulled it off their wire and didn't send it to the newspapers. So they censored it right there. Photographing dead bodies, it doesn't get me off, it doesn't make my mother proud, but if I don't do this, if I don't photograph these scenes, people will think war is just like what they see in the movies.
The movie began to go wrong on the Basra Road. Bush realized that the public, confronted with the reality of war, wouldn't take much more of it. Today, the legacy of the Gulf War lingers on not just in the sick soldiers, but in the contaminated battlefields of Iraq and Kuwait. We were the first Western crew to be allowed into the Gulf battle zone since